Under the hush of prairie winds, whispers spread of a young Amish girl who fled her father's merciless whip, vanishing into the wild as thunder rolled. Some said she would perish in the forest, swallowed by hunger and fear. Yet others claimed she stumbled upon the cabin of a mountain man, silent, feared, and untouched by woman's hand. Could innocence find safety in the arms of a recluse, or would his hidden scars prove more dangerous than the father she fled? And when the past comes hunting, whose courage will be enough to stand against cruelty and redeem the broken? When the whip cracked and the wilderness grew darker, one question lingered. Could kindness truly shelter the broken, or would cruelty prevail again? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories like this bind us together across towns, across states, across every frontier of the heart. If you still believe in respect, courage, and compassion, then you already ride alongside this tale. Let me know in the comments which state you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe so we can keep sharing these stories of redemption and hope with you every day. They said the whip cracked louder than thunder in that quiet valley, and that its echo carried further than any hymn sung in the Amish meeting house. Miriam, the youngest daughter of stern Jacob Stoltzfus, was the one who bore it. Her small frame and solemn eyes had long been the target of his rage, though no sin of hers could ever justify it. The neighbors whispered of Jacob's iron hand, his unbending ways, but in those days a father's house was a fortress none dared question. Behind closed doors, Miriam lived beneath the shadow of a leather lash and the weight of silence. On that fateful night, the sky itself seemed to rage against such cruelty. Clouds gathered thick and black, rolling across the moon like a curtain. The cattle grew restless in their stalls, lowing as if they, too, knew the storm was coming. Inside the dim farmhouse, Jacob's fury boiled over. His voice was a thunderclap, his hand a weapon. Miriam's crime was small, her stitching uneven on a simple cloth, but her punishment promised to be severe. She cowered as the whip coiled in his grasp, the handle worn smooth by years of use, the leather gleaming in the lantern light. The first strike kissed the air, not yet her skin, and in that heartbeat of reprieve, Miriam chose. She would not break, not tonight. Her bare feet flew across the wooden floor, skirts gathered in trembling hands. As the whip lashed the air behind her, she fled through the door, her father's shout drowned by the storm that broke upon the valley. Rain poured in sudden sheets, soaking her bonnet, clinging to her plain dress, turning the earth into a mire beneath her feet. Each step into the night was a step into exile. Behind her lay the only world she had known, a world of barns and buggies, hymns and fields, and a father whose heart had grown harder than stone. Before her stretched the unknown wilderness, its blackened trees clawing at the sky, its shadows whispering of wolves and worse. Yet even fear of the dark could not rival fear of the whip. Branches whipped her cheeks as she stumbled deeper into the forest. Her breath came in sobs, her chest burning with terror and rain. She prayed, not with words but with desperation, that some mercy might meet her in the storm. The ground was uneven, roots and rocks catching her steps. Still she pressed on, driven by a will she had never known she possessed. For the first time in her life, Miriam was choosing her own path, even if it led to death in the wilderness. The thunder rolled like a drumbeat of judgment, but within its roar there was something else, something faint. Through the trees, beyond the veil of storm, a single glow shone against the blackness. It was not lightning, not the cold light of heaven's fury, but the warm, steady glimmer of firelight through a cabin window. Miriam stumbled toward it, half mad with exhaustion, her legs trembling beneath her. With each step, the glow grew brighter, until it stood before her like a beacon in the storm. She fell to her knees at the edge of the clearing, drenched and trembling, staring at that window where the lamplight burned. She did not know who lived there, nor whether they would turn her away, or worse. Yet some instinct told her that behind those rough-hewn logs, behind that simple door, lay her only chance at refuge. With the whip still echoing in her ears and the storm raging at her back, Miriam rose once more. She lifted a hand, shaking, and pressed it against the cabin door, and in that breathless moment between terror and hope, her life as she had known it ended, and a new story began. The night swallowed Miriam whole as she ran, her breath torn from her chest in ragged bursts. Rain poured through the canopy of black branches, dripping cold rivulets down her neck and plastering her bonnet to her hair. The sharp gravel of the farm lane had already bruised her bare feet, but she dared not slow. Each step into the forest was a defiance of her father's authority. Each gasp of storm-heavy air a rejection of the life she had known. She stumbled over roots, slick with rain. Her skirts tangled about her ankles, yet still she pressed deeper into the wild. Behind her, the farmhouse windows glowed faintly through the sheets of rain, like watchful eyes fading into the distance. She knew if she turned back, she would see the silhouette of her father on the porch, whip in hand, waiting for her return. But Miriam's heart told her there was no going back. To return was to surrender her soul to torment. To go forward was to gamble her life against the mercies of the wilderness. Thunder cracked overhead, so violent it seemed the heavens themselves had split apart. The forest echoed the sound, branches groaning and snapping beneath the wind. Every noise was magnified in her terror, the shriek of an owl, the rustle of unseen creatures in the underbrush. The night was alive, and it pressed close upon her, reminding her how small she was, how defenseless. Her faith, once the anchor of her childhood, felt like a fragile thread in the teeth of the storm. She whispered a prayer as she stumbled forward, not the measured cadence of Amish hymns, but a desperate plea for survival. Lord, lead me away from cruelty, into your mercy. The forest floor turned treacherous, mud sucking at her feet, cold seeping through the thin soles of her skin. Sharp stones cut into her, and she winced, biting back a cry. Her body trembled from the cold, but also from fear, the fear that she would collapse and never rise, that the storm would consume her before she found shelter. Her father's voice still rang in her ears, harsh and condemning, as though the whip itself pursued her through the trees. She paused against the trunk of a great oak, pressing her hand to the bark for balance. Her chest heaved, her eyes blurred with tears and rain. For a moment, despair clawed at her. How long could a girl alone last in such a place? Was she to perish in the wilderness, like a stray lamb lost from the flock? Then, through the tangled limbs and driving rain, she saw it. A faint glimmer, distant yet unmistakable, wavered through the storm. At first, she thought it was lightning, but the light did not vanish with the thunder's roll. It burned steady, warm, like a candle set in defiance of the night. Hope surged within her, fragile but real, and she stumbled toward it, heart pounding with renewed strength. The branches clawed at her sleeves, tugging her back, but Miriam pressed forward, eyes fixed on that golden beacon. The mud sucked at her heels, stones pierced her skin, but the light pulled her onward, as though it carried a promise she dared not ignore. Her breath came in sobs now, mingling with the storm, each step a triumph of will over despair. At last, she broke through the thicket and into a clearing. There, it was a rough-hewn cabin, its single window glowing against the storm like a star fallen to earth. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, rising into the rain. The sight rooted her to the spot, trembling and awestruck. It was no grand refuge, only a humble shelter, but to her it was salvation. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed into the mud at the clearing's edge, sobs racking her chest. She clutched her arms around herself, torn between fear and desperate longing. Who lived within that cabin? Would they cast her out, or worse, would they hand her back to her father? Yet even as dread whispered its warnings, hope pushed her onward. Summoning what little strength remained, Miriam rose and staggered across the clearing. The storm roared at her back, as though urging her into the circle of light. She reached the door at last, her hand trembling as it hovered over the rough wood. For a moment, she hesitated, poised between the cruelty she had fled and the unknown mercy she sought. Then she pressed her palm against the door, rainwater dripping from her sleeve, and felt the solid strength beneath her touch. In that single heartbeat, she knew her journey had carried her to the edge of fate itself. Whether salvation or ruin waited inside, she had no choice but to enter. And as lightning split the sky behind her, Miriam took a breath, lifted her hand, and knocked. The door creaked open on its heavy hinges, and for a moment Miriam could see nothing but the flicker of lamplight spilling into the storm. Then he filled the frame, a towering figure that seemed carved from the very mountains themselves. His shoulders were broad beneath a worn wool shirt, his beard long and unkempt, his hair hanging past his collar in wild strands. His eyes, shadowed by the brim of a weathered hat, gleamed with a sharpness that froze her where she stood. The stories she had heard whispered in town rose in her mind, of the mountain man who lived apart from all others, of the hermit who spoke to no one, who bore curses upon his name. To stand at his threshold now felt like stepping into the maw of some myth half believed, half feared. For a breathless instant, Miriam wished the storm had swallowed her instead. Her body trembled, soaked through and shivering, her lips parted but no words rising. The man's gaze bore into her, silent and unyielding, as though measuring whether she was trespasser, beggar, or threat. Behind him, the cabin glowed with warmth, the crackle of fire on the hearth, the scent of wood smoke, the glow of safety so near yet barred by his presence. Finally, his voice came, low and rough as stones rolling in a riverbed. "What do you want here?" The question hung like judgment. Miriam's throat tightened. She could not bring herself to speak of the whip, of her father, of the cruelty that had driven her into the storm. She could only whisper, broken and earnest, "Shelter." He studied her for a long moment, rain dripping from her bonnet onto the threshold. The silence stretched until she thought he might close the door in her face, cast her back to the storm as so many might have done. Then, with a grunt that was neither kindness nor cruelty, he stepped aside. "Come in, then." Miriam crossed into the cabin, as though stepping into another world. The warmth of the fire wrapped around her, bringing sudden tears to her eyes. The room was simple but sturdy, a rough-hewn table, shelves lined with jars and tools, a bed pushed against the far wall. Everything bore the mark of one man's labor, unpolished but strong. She felt small within it, an intruder in a kingdom built of solitude. The man closed the door behind her, and the storm's roar dulled to a muffled growl outside. For a moment, the only sound was the pop of the fire and the drip of water from her clothes onto the floor. Then he moved past her, his heavy boots thudding against the boards, and reached for a coarse blanket folded on a chair. Without a word, he thrust it toward her. She clutched it to her chest, the rough wool scratching against her skin but bringing blessed warmth. Her stomach gave a faint, humiliating growl, and though she ducked her head, he must have heard it. He turned toward the table, tore a piece of coarse bread from a loaf, and set it on a plate before her. She stared at it, disbelief mingling with gratitude. This man, whom the world called cursed and cruel, had offered her what she had never expected, kindness. She ate in silence, her hands trembling as she brought the bread to her lips. He said nothing more, only leaned against the wall near the fire, arms crossed, watching her with that brooding gaze. Yet there was no malice in it, only a wary curiosity, as though he himself did not understand why he had let her stay. Miriam's heart, still bruised by fear, felt the first stirrings of something unfamiliar, trust, fragile, uncertain, but real. In that cabin of shadows and silence, with the storm raging beyond the walls, she had found not the curse of the mountain man, but the faintest glimmer of refuge. The storm battered the cabin walls, rattling the shutters and sending a mournful whistle through the gaps in the wood, but inside the fire kept its steady glow. Miriam sat close to the hearth, the coarse blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her eyes darting to the man who had permitted her entrance. He had given his name only once, in a voice that seemed reluctant to form the word, as though it was a relic from another life. Elias. Beyond that, he offered nothing, no explanation, no questions, no reassurance. He moved about the cabin in silence, setting a pot near the flames, laying tools back in their places, each motion deliberate and unhurried. Miriam's heart had not yet slowed from its frantic flight. Though her body began to warm, her spirit remained trembling. The quiet between them was heavy, different from the silence of her father's home. Her father's silence had been a weapon, filled with condemnation, broken only by the whip's crack or his voice raised in anger. Elias's silence was different, brooding, unreadable, a wall that kept her from knowing whether she was safe. When he finally spoke, it startled her. "You'll stay the night. Come morning, we'll see what's to be done." His words were not unkind, but neither were they open to debate. They were the words of a man used to giving commands to himself and hearing no reply. She nodded quickly, clutching the blanket tighter. Gratitude warred with unease. She had escaped her father's wrath only to find herself once more under the roof of a stern man who made the rules. Yet there was a difference. Elias's hand held no whip, his eyes no cruelty. Still, his presence loomed large, his silence filling the room like smoke. As she finished the bread he had given, Miriam folded her hands in her lap and bowed her head. The words of prayer came softly, so softly she wondered if he would even hear them over the fire. Lord, keep me from harm, make a way where I see none. Deliver me from the hand of the wicked. The words trembled in the air, fragile and earnest, yet they seemed to brush against Elias like an unwelcome draught. He shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening. He said nothing, but his silence grew heavier, almost defiant, as though her whispered faith reminded him of wounds he had long buried. Miriam felt it but did not stop. Her prayer was all she had, the only tether to hope in this strange refuge. When she lifted her eyes, Elias was staring into the fire, his face unreadable in the glow. She could not tell if her presence burdened him or if some deeper sorrow stirred in him at the sound of her voice. The air between them was tense, not hostile but weighted with things unsaid, as though innocence and isolation sat across from each other, each unsure how to coexist. When the storm quieted to a steady rain, Elias rose, fetched a spare blanket, and spread it on a pallet near the hearth. "You'll sleep here," he said simply. No gesture of comfort, no explanation, only the facts stated, and the distance kept. Miriam lowered herself onto the rough bedding, her body weary but her spirit restless. She curled beneath the blanket, the warmth of the fire softening her trembling limbs. Still, her eyes lingered on Elias, who sat back in his chair, silent and brooding, a man carved of solitude. He seemed a sentinel more than a host, keeping watch not for her, but against her, as though letting her remain was a risk he had not yet accepted. At last, her eyelids grew heavy, the weight of exhaustion pulling her toward sleep. The crackle of the fire and the steady drip of rain lulled her, though the tension of the room pressed even into her dreams. And so Miriam slept, not yet free, but not yet condemned, held in a space between danger and deliverance. The whip no longer hung over her, yet its memory lingered, just as Elias's silence lingered in the cabin, dark and unyielding. For this night at least, she was safe. For tomorrow, no promise could be made. Morning came with a thin veil of mist rising from the forest floor, the storm spent but leaving the world damp and heavy with silence. Miriam woke to the sound of wood being split outside, the steady rhythm of an axe cleaving through logs. For a moment she thought herself back on her father's farm, the sound so familiar, but the rough wool beneath her cheek and the warmth of the fire told her otherwise. She sat up slowly, clutching the blanket to her chest, her eyes wandering around the cabin that had become, however briefly, her refuge. Everything inside was neat and ordered. Though not delicate, each item had a purpose, each surface worn by use. It was the dwelling of a man who lived by necessity alone. She rose, smoothing her dress as best she could, and went to the door. Elias stood near the chopping block, his frame broad against the pale morning sky, the axe rising and falling with measured force. He did not look at her, though surely he sensed her watching. When he carried a fresh load of wood inside, their eyes met briefly. Without a word, he dropped the logs near the hearth and returned outside. Miriam's heart fluttered with the awkwardness of her place here, but she could not sit idle. She gathered the logs, stacking them neatly by the fire, and then set about sweeping the floor with a straw broom she found leaned against the wall. The motions were small but steady, familiar tasks that gave her trembling hands something to do. Elias re-entered, pausing at the sight of her bent over the broom, his brows furrowed, suspicion flickering across his face, as though uncertain whether she was helping or trespassing into his order. Yet he said nothing, only carried on with his work. At the well behind the cabin, Miriam pulled up a bucket of water, her arms straining but determined. She brought it inside and filled the pot near the hearth. When she caught Elias watching her, his arms crossed, she felt her cheeks burn. She lowered her gaze, whispering. It seemed the thing to do. He gave no reply, only shifted his weight. His expression caught somewhere between disapproval and reluctant acceptance. As the day lengthened, The cabin grew less strange beneath her touch. Miriam fed the fire, wiped down the table, and folded the spare blanket that had kept her warm. Each act was her quiet offering, a way of proving she was not a burden. Elias's silence followed her everywhere, but in it she began to sense something more complicated than coldness. He was watchful, wary, as though her every movement unsettled ground he had thought long hardened. When evening fell, Miriam sat near the fire and, without planning, began to hum. The tune was an old hymn, one she had sung many times in the plain meeting house of her childhood. Her voice trembled at first, soft and uncertain, but the melody carried strength of its own. She closed her eyes and let the words rise, fragile yet clear, a prayer set to music, a plea for mercy and light in a world of shadows. Elias froze where he stood by the window, his hand, resting on the sill, curled into a fist as the sound reached him. The hymn's sweetness pierced the armor he had worn for years, stirring echoes he had buried beneath silence and solitude. He saw, in that moment, not the storm-soaked girl who had stumbled to his door, but the ghost of his wife, her voice carrying the same notes by lamplight long ago. The memory cut sharp, but alongside the pain was something gentler, a reminder that not all songs had been silenced. Miriam's eyes opened, and she caught him staring. For an instant, his expression was unguarded, his gaze softened, his silence almost tender. Then, as if ashamed of what had shown, he turned away, retreating into the shadows of the cabin. Yet the hymn lingered in the air, fragile but unbroken, and Miriam felt for the first time that she was not entirely unwelcome. A seed had been planted, though neither dared to name it, and in the quiet glow of the fire, innocence and grief began, however slightly, to reach toward each other. The days fell into a rhythm, quiet and unremarkable to the outside world, but to Miriam they carried the weight of something new. Each morning she rose with the first light that slipped between the cracks of the cabin walls, pulling her shawl close and tending to the fire before Elias stirred. She fetched water from the well, chopped kindling with cautious hands under his watchful eye, and swept the floors until the cabin felt less like a stranger's dwelling and more like a place where she could breathe. Elias said little, but he no longer looked upon her with suspicion. His silence became less of a wall and more of a landscape, vast, lonely, but no longer hostile. One morning, while gathering berries at the edge of the clearing, Miriam found a small bird lying in the grass. Its wing bent at an unnatural angle. It fluttered helplessly, its cries faint against the hush of the forest. Her heart clenched at the sight. She scooped it gently into her hands, murmuring words of comfort as though the fragile creature could understand. Carrying it back to the cabin, she wrapped it in a scrap of cloth and laid it near the hearth where the warmth might ease its trembling. When Elias returned from his traps and saw the bird resting in a basket by the fire, his brow furrowed. "It will not live," he said, his voice low, as if stating a fact of nature rather than cruelty. Miriam lifted her chin, her fingers stroking the bird's feathers. "It might, if it is cared for. Even the smallest creature deserves a chance." Her words hung in the air, earnest and unwavering. For a long moment he stood there, his face shadowed, and then he turned away without another word. Day by day, Miriam fed the bird with crumbs soaked in water, holding it gently as it struggled to eat. She cleaned its wounds, spoke softly to it, sang hymns while it lay nestled in its basket. Slowly, its eyes grew brighter, its body steadier. The wing, once twisted and limp, began to heal beneath her patient care. In its recovery, she found a mirror of herself once broken, trembling, yet now drawing strength in a place that was not yet home but promised shelter. Elias observed in silence, though she often caught him watching from across the room. He never touched the bird, never bent close as she did, but his gaze softened when he saw it flutter weakly against her hands. One evening, when Miriam was certain he thought she did not notice, he placed a small dish of grain beside the basket. He said nothing, but his gesture spoke louder than words. The weeks passed, and with them, a fragile peace settled over the cabin. Miriam no longer jumped at the sound of his boots on the floor or the scrape of his chair. She grew accustomed to his quiet presence, to the way his voice rumbled low when he gave brief instructions, to the way he stepped aside to let her pass without ever brushing too close. He, in turn, allowed her space to move freely within the walls he had once guarded like a fortress. When at last the bird's wing had healed enough for it to take flight, Miriam carried it to the clearing. Elias stood a few paces away, arms crossed, his face unreadable. She opened her hands, and the small creature paused, as if reluctant to leave the safety it had known. Then, with a sudden flutter, it lifted into the air, wings catching the light of the setting Sunday. Miriam watched, her heart swelling, tears stinging her eyes at the sight of freedom reclaimed. For the first time since she had entered his cabin, Elias spoke without sternness. "You gave it a chance." His voice was quiet, almost reverent. She turned toward him, her face glowing with a smile both weary and hopeful. "We all deserve one." In that moment, something shifted. The silence between them no longer felt like a cage, but a space where understanding might grow. The bird had flown, but its lesson remained, binding them in unspoken acknowledgement. Life, once banished from Elias's home, had begun to return not only to the cabin, but to the wounded hearts within it. The forest had softened with the turning of weeks, its sharp edges no longer quite so menacing. Miriam had learned the sounds of its mornings, the way the birds trilled in the mist and the way dew clung to every blade of grass. Within the cabin, a rhythm of survival had blossomed into something more, though neither she nor Elias spoke of it aloud. He still carried himself like a man cloaked in solitude, but the silence between them had begun to change. It was no longer a shield against her presence, but a space where words cautiously crept in. It began one morning when she followed him to the woodpile. Elias lifted the axe as he always did, splitting the logs with a steady strength, but when he saw her watching, he paused. "You'll need to know this," he muttered, setting the axe upright in the block. Miriam blinked at him, startled that he would offer instruction rather than a curt dismissal. With hesitation, she stepped forward, her hands tentative on the rough handle. He positioned her fingers, steadying the haft in her palms. His touch was brief, almost reluctant, but it carried a weight that startled her heart. "Swing from your shoulders, not your arms. Let the weight of it do the work," he said, stepping back. She raised the axe awkwardly, the tool heavy in her grip, and brought it down with more effort than skill. The log split only slightly, the blade catching in the grain. She flushed with embarrassment, but Elias did not scold. He only grunted. Again. She tried once more, her brow furrowed, and this time the log cracked clean in two. A smile broke across her face before she could suppress it, and to her astonishment, Elias's stern mouth twitched as though fighting its own response. He nodded once, the closest thing to praise he had offered, and turned back to his own work. That evening, when he showed her how to set a snare along the game trails, Miriam's laughter slipped free. She had fumbled with the loop of cord, tangling it hopelessly, and when at last it collapsed into a mess at her feet, she covered her mouth to stifle the sound. But it came out anyway, soft at first, then bubbling into true mirth, bright and unrestrained. It startled her as much as it startled him. She had not laughed so openly since childhood, and in that moment she remembered what it felt like to breathe without fear. Elias turned his head, staring at her as though he were seeing something long forgotten. The echo of her laughter filled the clearing, rising above the whisper of wind in the trees. He had lived years without such a sound, years where silence had been his only companion, and now that fragile melody unsettled him. It awakened something he had sworn to bury, something that had lain dormant beneath grief and self-imposed exile. Back in the cabin, her voice lingered in the air like an ember refusing to fade. Miriam, tired but light-hearted, hummed while she laid out the bread for supper. Elias sat in his chair by the fire, staring at the flames, but his mind was elsewhere. He could still hear her laughter, feel the way it had unsettled the stillness he had built around himself. He told himself it meant nothing, that she was merely a guest, a passerby whose presence would not last. Yet the cracks in his armor were there, undeniable. When she offered him his share of bread, their hands brushed, and though the touch was fleeting, he drew in a breath as if it had caught him off guard. He accepted the food without a word, but his silence no longer bore the same weight. It was different now, less a barrier, more a struggle against feelings he dared not name. As the firelight flickered across the walls, Miriam sat opposite him, her smile faint but lingering, her eyes lowered in quiet contentment. Elias studied her from the shadows, torn between resistance and surrender. The recluse who had once sworn to live alone felt the stirrings of change, though he could not yet admit it to himself. Her laughter had seeped into the cracks of his solitude, and no matter how tightly he tried to hold the pieces together, something within him had begun to shift. The evening had settled heavy over the mountains, the air outside cool and fragrant with pine. Inside the cabin, the firelight flickered across the rough-hewn walls, casting long shadows that seemed to sway with the crackle of the flames. Miriam sat at the table, her hands folded over her lap, watching Elias as he worked a piece of wood with his knife. His eyes never lifted, his movements slow and steady, as though shaping the timber gave his restless hands some purpose. She had grown used to his silence, but tonight it pressed differently, not with suspicion, but with weight, like the hush that falls before a confession. Her heart had stirred with a question for many days, one she had swallowed for fear of offending him. But as the fire popped and the forest whispered beyond the shutters, she found her courage. "Elias," she said softly, her voice carrying the careful tone of a prayer. He did not look up, but his hand stilled on the blade. "Why do you live here, so far from the town, so far from everyone?" The silence stretched until Miriam feared she had broken whatever fragile peace had grown between them. Then, with a slow exhale, Elias set down the wood and knife. His broad shoulders sagged, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked not like the mountain itself, but a man bowed beneath its weight. "I did not always live alone," he said, his voice low and rough, the sound of a door long barred being forced open. His gaze turned toward the fire, and in its glow his eyes glistened, not with anger, but with memory. "I had a wife, Sarah, and a little boy, Jacob." He paused, the names trembling as though they cut him to speak. "The cabin you see here is not the first I built. The first stood on the other side of this ridge, strong walls, a good roof, a place meant for a family." Miriam leaned forward, her breath caught in her chest. She did not speak, afraid that any word would shatter the fragile thread he had chosen to follow. "One winter's night," he continued, his voice breaking at the edges, "the lantern fell. I was out tending to the stock. By the time I returned, the cabin was a pyre. Flames, reaching higher than the trees, smoke choking the sky. I tried, God knows I tried, but the fire had claimed them before I could reach the door. My hands were seared raw, but I could not touch them, could not pull them free." His voice cracked, and he held up his scarred palms as though the fire still burned upon them. Miriam's eyes filled with tears, spilling silently down her cheeks. She did not recoil from his scars, nor from the anguish that shadowed his face. She only whispered, broken with compassion, "I am so sorry." Elias shook his head, his jaw tight. "Sorry cannot change what I failed to do. I left the world that night, Miriam. Left it because I was not fit to walk among men who keep their families safe. My exile here is no curse, only the penance I chose." His eyes flickered toward her then, sharp yet wounded, as though daring her to condemn him. But Miriam did not condemn. Her tears glistened in the firelight as she reached across the table, her small hand resting gently upon the scarred surface of his. The touch was light, almost hesitant, but it carried more grace than any words. "You loved them," she said simply, "and love is not erased by loss. It is still here." Elias bowed his head, overcome by the sincerity of her voice. For years he had borne his grief in silence, convinced no soul could share its weight. Yet now, as Miriam's hand lingered on his, he felt a sliver of that burden ease. For the first time since the fire, his loneliness was not absolute. A crack had opened in the prison he had built around his heart, and through it the faint light of compassion began to shine. In the town beyond the ridge, where the meeting-house bell tolled each Sunday, and gossip flowed as freely as creek water, whispers of Miriam's disappearance spread like wildfire. At first, some believed she had run to a cousin's farm, or perhaps wandered too far into the fields. But as the days turned to weeks with no sign of her bonnet among the rows of corn, tongues sharpened. The neighbors recalled Jacob Stoltzfus's harsh ways, though none dared speak them aloud when he passed on the road. Behind closed doors, however, their voices grew bold. She fled, some said, and who could blame her? Her father heard those whispers too, and each one struck like a lash across his pride. Jacob was a man accustomed to control, his household ruled by fear, his word unchallenged. For his daughter to vanish not only stripped him of power over her, but painted him a fool before his brethren. Humiliation brewed into rage, and rage demanded an outlet. It was then that the railroad agent appeared in town, a man with a polished coat, a gleaming pocket watch, and a smile that never reached his eyes. This agent, Mr. Carver, had long coveted the stretch of land deep in the mountains where Elias's cabin stood. Surveyors had marked it on their maps, whispering of timber ripe for harvest and ground sturdy enough for a rail line to cut through the wilderness. Yet every attempt to claim it had met a wall. One solitary man who refused all offers, ignored all threats, and lived beyond the grasp of town and company alike. Elias, the recluse, was an obstacle Carver could not bypass. When Jacob Stoltzfus, red-faced with fury, sought allies to retrieve his wayward daughter, Carver saw opportunity gleam. Over mugs of bitter coffee in the town's inn, the two men struck a dark accord. Jacob spoke of his daughter as though she were stolen property, his words thick with indignation. Carver leaned in, listening with the patience of a vulture. "Then we are agreed," Carver said smoothly, his tone oily with satisfaction. "The girl must be returned to her rightful place, and the man who harbors her must be driven out. His land will no longer stand in the way of progress." The partnership was forged in selfishness, one seeking to restore his pride through domination, the other seeking wealth through greed. Between them, Miriam was nothing more than a means, a pawn in their schemes. To Jacob, she was disobedience that must be broken. To Carver, she was leverage to unseat the mountain man. Their ambitions twined together like two serpents, tightening toward the same prey. Rumors thickened in town as the men made their plans. Some whispered that Jacob had enlisted the law to hunt her down. Others claimed Carver's hired men had been seen heading toward the mountains, their rifles slung across their backs. A few, with softer hearts, wondered aloud if the girl had found shelter and begged that she be left in peace. But their voices were drowned beneath the chorus of greed and fear. Back in the cabin, Miriam knew nothing of the storm gathering beyond the ridge. She carried water from the well, tended the garden Elias had reluctantly allowed her to plant, and sang her hymns in the quiet of evening. Elias, though, sensed it. He often stood at the edge of the clearing, scanning the horizon, his scarred hands curling into fists at the distant echoes of danger he could not yet name. His solitude had long shielded him from the world, but now the world was stirring, hungry and relentless. The peace they had built, fragile as the mended wing of the bird Miriam had set free, trembled with the weight of shadows creeping closer. In town, two men schemed, one blinded by pride, the other by profit, and together they cast their eyes upon the wilderness. They would not rest until both Miriam and the land itself were seized, and Elias, once the silent guardian of his solitude, would soon be called to stand against them. The market square was alive with murmurs, louder than the shuffle of wagon wheels or the bray of mules. Women bent over baskets of apples and flour, their hands busy but their voices fixed on the same subject, the missing Stoltzfus girl. It was no longer a mystery where she had gone. A trapper returning from the ridge had spoken of a figure moving about the clearing near the hermit's cabin, a girl with a bonnet shading her face. Word spread quickly, and now the town turned it over like a shiny coin, admiring one side and condemning the other. "She's with him, sure as sunrise," one man spat, shaking his head as he leaned on the fence outside the smithy. "That mountain devil's got her under his roof. God only knows what sin festers there." "Nonsense," replied another, though his tone carried little conviction. "He's a dangerous man, yes, but maybe he just pitied her. The girl was always quiet, always looking down. You know Jacob's temper. Maybe she found mercy where she couldn't at home." The women clucked their tongues. Some lowered their voices, speaking of shame, of how a girl's virtue would be tarnished beyond repair. Others glanced toward the church steeple and whispered that the Lord himself must see her flight as deliverance from a cruel hand. The town had split into two camps, those who condemned her as a runaway who sullied her family's name, and those who pitied her as a child driven into the wild by a father's lash. Through it all, Sister Ruth moved quietly, but with purpose. She was a midwife of many years, her face lined with age, but her eyes bright with the kind of wisdom that comes from tending life at its most fragile. She had delivered half the children in the valley, and her presence carried weight even among the men who filled the tavern with their hard words. When the talk grew cruel, she would clear her throat, and the room would hush. At the well one morning, she raised her voice against the tide of gossip. "You speak of that girl as though she is a piece of cloth, torn from a bolt, good for nothing but shame. Have you forgotten she is flesh and blood, a child of God, with bruises you cannot see, and scars you do not want to? Do not be so quick to cast stones." Her words cut through the murmurs, sharp yet tender, and several women lowered their eyes in shame. She reminded them of their own daughters, of the nights they had prayed for mercy during childbirth, of the days they had wept over graves dug too soon. "Compassion," Ruth said firmly, "is what keeps us human. Without it, we are no better than beasts that strike their own young." Some scoffed, muttering that her heart was too soft, but others felt the weight of truth in her words. In kitchens and barns that evening, the conversation turned. What if the girl had found not corruption, but safety in the hermit's cabin? What if the one they had long feared was not the monster, but the protector? The seeds were planted, small and uncertain, yet alive. Ruth watered them with every word she spoke, with every reminder that virtue was not measured in appearances but in mercy. She visited homes with newborns in her arms and left behind not only swaddled infants, but also whispered counsel. Do not judge her, pray for her. By the week's end, the town no longer spoke with a single voice. The division was clear. Some stood ready to condemn both Miriam and Elias at the first chance, siding with Jacob and the railroad agent who fueled their fears. But others began to look at their own hands and wonder if judgment would soil them more than pity ever could. In the meeting house pews, Ruth's steady presence reminded them all of a truth they had nearly forgotten, that even in a valley thick with pride and gossip, compassion could still be sown. It was only a matter of time before those seeds sprouted into courage, though the harvest had yet to come. For now, the town was split, its heart pulled in two directions, waiting for the moment when it would have to choose which master it served, cruelty or compassion. The morning had been still, the kind of silence that makes the forest seem watchful, as though every tree leans in to listen. Miriam was sweeping the cabin floor, her hair falling loose from her bonnet, when Elias stiffened by the window. His hand went to the rifle propped in the corner, though he did not lift it, only kept his eyes fixed on the trail that cut through the clearing. Miriam followed his gaze, and her breath caught. Two figures were approaching, one tall and broad-shouldered in his plain black coat, the other lean, polished, and smirking in a city man's suit. Even before their faces came clear, Miriam knew them. Her father's stride was rigid with rage, and at his side walked the railroad agent, Carver, whose silver watch chain glimmered even in the muted light. Elias opened the door before they reached it, stepping out onto the porch, his stance wide, his arms crossed. He looked every bit the mountain sentinel, immovable and unyielding. Miriam hovered just behind him, her heart hammering so loudly she feared it could be heard. Jacob Stoltzfus's face was red with fury, his eyes narrowing at the sight of his daughter. "Miriam," he barked, his voice sharp as the crack of a whip, "you will come home this instant. You shame your family, your church, and your God." Miriam flinched, but did not move forward. Her hands clutched the doorframe, her knuckles white. Elias's broad frame shielded her from view, and when he spoke, his voice was like stone grinding against stone. "The girl is not yours to command." Carver's smooth voice slid in, oily with false courtesy. Now, no need for hostility. This is a simple matter. The girl belongs with her family. Surely even you, mister. Elias, understand the law favors her father. His smile was thin, his eyes calculating as they flicked from the cabin to the land around it, measuring value in acres and timber. Elias's jaw tightened. Law or no law, she will not be dragged back to the lash. His words were plain, but they carried a weight that made the air between them heavy. Jacob's face twisted, his hand twitching as though he wished for the whip that had once cowed his daughter. "You dare speak against me, you, a godless hermit with no place among men. She is mine, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. You cannot keep her." Elias took a step closer, his shadow falling long across the porch. "Try to take her, and you'll find I am not so easily moved." For a moment, the clearing bristled with tension. Carver's smirk faltered, his polished shoes ill-suited for mud and conflict. Jacob's fury trembled on the edge of violence, but even he could see the immovable strength before him. They had not come to fight today, only to threaten. Carver laid a hand on Jacob's arm, speaking smoothly once more. "We will not quarrel here, not today, but make no mistake. Mountain man, the law can be made to bend, and force can be hired. We will return, and when we do, neither you nor the girl will stand in our way." Elias did not move, his silence more cutting than any retort. He simply stared them down until Jacob's rage sputtered into retreat, and Carver's smugness thinned into calculation. The two men turned back toward the trail, their figures receding into the trees, but their words hung in the air like storm clouds gathering. Miriam pressed her face into her hands, trembling with the weight of what had just passed. Elias returned inside, his steps heavy, his expression carved in iron. He set the rifle against the wall once more, but did not look at her immediately. At last he spoke, his voice low, grim, but steady. "They will come again, and when they do, we will be ready. No, maybe, untamed." The fire crackled in the hearth, but its warmth felt faint against the chill left behind. Miriam knew the storm that had once driven her into the wilderness was not yet over. It was only beginning, and now the battle was no longer only hers to bear. Elias had claimed her defense, and in doing so, had invited the wrath of men who would not stop until they had either broken him or been broken themselves. The forest seemed to hold its breath in the days after Jacob and Carver had come to the cabin. The birds still sang in the mornings, and the brook still ran clear over its stones, yet beneath the ordinary rhythms of nature lay a tension both Miriam and Elias could feel. It was as though the trees themselves knew that men carried dark intentions up the mountain, and that sooner or later the peace they guarded would be tested. Still, for a time, quiet reigned, and in that fragile reprieve Miriam and Elias drew nearer, not by grand gestures but through the steady, unspoken recognition that they were no longer alone. Miriam tended to her daily tasks with a diligence born not only of survival but of gratitude. She swept the cabin, gathered herbs from the forest edge, and mended worn seams in Elias's shirts with neat stitches. He, in turn, taught her small things she had never been allowed to learn at home: how to mend a snare, how to tell when rain was coming by the smell of the wind, how to sharpen a blade so it could serve faithfully. These lessons carried no sentiment, no soft words, but in each one Miriam felt his unspoken trust. One evening, after the chores were finished and the fire burned low, Miriam pulled from beneath her shawl a small, tattered journal she had taken when she fled her father's house. Its cover was worn, its pages blank, for she had never dared write in it under Jacob's eye. She laid it on the table and opened it slowly, her hands trembling as though the act itself required courage. Elias glanced at her, curiosity flickering in his gaze, but he said nothing. She dipped the nib of a pen into ink she had found among Elias's supplies and began to write. At first, her words were halting, uncertain, but soon they flowed, pouring from her heart as if a floodgate had been opened. She wrote of the whip and the fear, of the night she fled into the storm, of the warmth of the cabin that had saved her. She wrote of the wounded bird she had nursed and how it had flown free, a mirror of her own hope. Her hand cramped, but she pressed on, each line giving shape to pain that had long remained silent. Elias sat in his chair by the fire, whittling as he often did, but his ears were tuned to the soft scratch of her pen. He could not see the words, but he could feel the weight they carried. From time to time he lifted his eyes, watching the furrow of her brow, the way her lips pressed together in concentration. There was a light in her face as she wrote, one he had not seen before, as though she were discovering herself anew in the act. When at last she set the pen down, her fingers ink-stained. She looked up and met his gaze. "I never thought my voice mattered," she said quietly. "At home, there was no room for it, but here." Her words trailed off, but the meaning lingered. Here, in the safety he had given, she had found a space to grow. Elias did not answer immediately. His eyes returned to the fire, shadows dancing across his scarred face. At last he said, "Keep writing. It will remind you who you are when others try to tell you otherwise." His voice was rough but sincere, carrying a weight of understanding she had not expected. The nights grew longer, and the journal filled with pages. Miriam wrote of dreams she had once buried, of songs she had sung in secret, of fears she still carried. Elias never asked to read her words, yet she sometimes shared them aloud, her voice soft but steady. In those moments, the silence of the cabin shifted, no longer brooding but companionable, as though the very walls were learning to hold hope again. Outside, the world prepared for storm, but inside, the cabin became more than a shelter. It was a place where wounds slowly knit, where trust rooted itself like a seedling in spring soil. Miriam's pen whispered across the pages. Elias's knife shaped wood into quiet forms, and between them lay a bond unspoken yet undeniable. They were bracing for the darkness to come, but for now they cherished the stillness, knowing it might not last. The calm was fragile, but it was theirs, and within it both Miriam and Elias began to believe, if only faintly, that light could yet endure against the gathering shadows. The town had grown restless in the wake of Jacob Stoltzfus's rage and Carver's polished schemes. Each man carried his cause like a banner, and their voices had filled the tavern and the meeting house alike. Jacob thundered about disobedience, painting Miriam as a wayward child who had stained his honor. Carver spoke more smoothly, but no less dangerously, of progress and prosperity, of the riches a rail line could bring if only the mountain were cleared of its stubborn recluse. Their words stirred fear, and fear spread quickly among people already uncertain of the world's changes. But in the quiet corners of kitchens, in the pauses between market haggling, there were other voices too. Whispers of Miriam's bruised childhood, of the whip said to crack in her father's home, of the quiet dignity with which she had always borne her lot. Some said it was no sin to run from cruelty. Others admitted they had feared Elias for years, yet none could name a true crime he had committed. The town swayed like a wheat field in a fickle wind, leaning first one way, then the other, waiting for a voice strong enough to anchor them. That voice came from Sister Ruth. She had listened long enough to the arguments of men whose motives reeked of pride and greed. On a Sunday afternoon, after service had ended, she rose in the meeting house and faced the gathered congregation. Her frame was small, her hair gray beneath her bonnet, but her eyes burned with a fire that could not be ignored. "You all know me," she began, her voice steady. "I have delivered your children into this world, and I have sat with many of you when death came to your door. I have seen what truly matters: the breath of life in an infant's lungs, the clasp of hands when a family says farewell. And I tell you now, what is being spoken in this town is not born of righteousness. It is born of cruelty and greed." The room stilled, men shifting uncomfortably, women bowing their heads. Ruth pressed on. "You whisper that Miriam shames her family. I ask you, what greater shame is there than a father's hand raised against his child? You fear the mountain man because he is different, because he chooses solitude. But have you asked yourself what harm he has done? Who among you has he cheated, stolen from, or struck down? None. He has done no evil but live quietly, while others cast him as a monster to make their own power seem just." Her words cut through the fog of gossip. Some frowned, unwilling to release their fear, but others nodded slowly, conviction stirring. Ruth's gaze swept the room, resting on mothers clutching their children, on men who had once been boys under their father's harsh rule. "Cruelty cannot build our future," she said, her voice rising. "And greed will only strip us of what little peace we have. If we stand by while a child is dragged back to pain and a man is robbed of his home, what will that make us? A town without a soul." The silence that followed was heavy, but it was different than before. It was the silence of seeds sinking deep into soil. When the congregation dispersed, their talk had changed. Not all at once, not with perfect unity, but the tide had begun to turn. At the well, women repeated Ruth's words with quiet conviction. At the smithy, men grumbled that perhaps the girl deserved peace, and perhaps Elias was not the villain they had made him. The whispers that once condemned now began to soften, to question, to murmur of support. In her small cottage that evening, Ruth knelt in prayer, her hands folded tight. She knew the storm was not yet past, that Jacob and Carver would press their cause with greater force. But she also knew the town's heart had been stirred, that compassion had been remembered. What began as a lone voice in the meeting house was becoming a chorus, faint but growing. The people were awakening, and when the time came, she believed they would stand not with cruelty, but with mercy. The air in town thickened with unease as Carver and Jacob pressed forward with their schemes. Carver's polished boots clicked on the boards of the courthouse steps. His hat tipped just so, his smile thin as a blade. He carried with him a folded packet of papers, the kind stamped with seals and flourishes that made ordinary folk step back in awe. He spoke with authority to those who would listen, declaring that Elias's land was never rightfully his, that old deeds proved it belonged to the railroad, and that Elias had squatted unlawfully for years. The words tasted of law, but their roots were lies, for Carver himself had ordered the forgeries, each page crafted to strip a solitary man of his last possession. Jacob Stoltzfus walked at his side, less refined, but no less dangerous. His voice was raw with fury, his words carrying the sharp edge of personal vendetta. He told the townsfolk that his daughter was being held against her will, that the hermit on the mountain had poisoned her mind, turned her from her faith, and hidden her away. He spoke of fatherly duty, of divine right, cloaking his cruelty in piety. "She is my flesh," he thundered. "She belongs under my roof, as Scripture commands." Many nodded out of habit, though unease flickered in their eyes. The two men together made a formidable spectacle. Carver with his papers and his false authority, Jacob with his righteous bluster and his threats of shame upon the community. Their campaign spread like storm clouds over the valley, blotting out the fragile light Sister Ruth had kindled. At the market stalls, tongues wagged. "The girl will be dragged back any day now," some said, shaking their heads with false pity. "And the mountain man will be cast off that ridge, mark my words." Others bristled, arguing that what was happening smelled more of tyranny than justice, that no man should lose his land to greed, nor a daughter be forced into chains of cruelty. Lines began to form, invisible but unmistakable. On one side stood those who feared change, who clung to Jacob's authority and Carver's promise of prosperity. On the other stood those who had begun to remember compassion, who heard Sister Ruth's voice echoing in their hearts. The meeting house, once a place of unity, now hummed with division. In the tavern, arguments flared. Tankards slammed upon tables as men accused one another of siding with monsters or with liars. Ruth moved among them still, calm but firm. She reminded them that documents could be forged, that words could be twisted, but that truth lay plain before them if they chose to see it. "You know the girl," she said. "You saw her quiet strength even under her father's hand, and you know the hermit has harmed none of you. Ask yourselves whose cause serves love and whose serves greed." Her words swayed some, but the storm of deception raged too strongly to be dispelled in a single breath. Up in the mountains, Miriam and Elias felt the gathering pressure, though no messenger had brought them the news. Elias grew more watchful, scanning the tree line each evening, his rifle closer at hand. Miriam wrote in her journal by firelight, her hand steady, but her heart heavy with the sense that the fragile peace they had built was about to be torn open. She remembered the fury in her father's eyes, the cold smile on Carver's lips, and she prayed for strength not only for herself, but for the man who had given her shelter. The town itself stood at a crossroads. It could follow Jacob's wrath and Carver's greed into darkness, or it could remember compassion and rally to defend the innocent. The sky above seemed to mirror the choice, clouds rolling in heavy and dark, the horizon thick with the promise of thunder. Justice or tyranny, mercy or cruelty, soon the valley would be forced to decide, and the storm that had long been gathering would break with all its fury. The church hall was filled to the brim, the wooden pews creaking beneath the weight of bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder. The air was thick with tension, with whispers that rose and fell like the rustling of dry leaves. Lanterns hung from iron hooks, their glow casting sharp shadows across the whitewashed walls. At the front stood Jacob Stoltzfus, his broad frame and dark coat lending him the severity of a preacher, though his words held no gospel. Beside him lingered Carver, polished and smiling, a sheaf of papers tucked neatly beneath his arm, the glint of his pocket watch winking in the lamplight. Jacob's voice rang out first, sharp and booming. He spoke of rebellion, of a daughter who had defied her father's house and spit upon her vows of obedience. He painted her as a wayward child led astray by a recluse who dwelled outside the bonds of faith and law. "She is mine," he thundered, his face red with passion, "by birth, by blood, by God's command, and I will have her back. This hermit has bewitched her, and if you allow this to stand, you invite chaos into every home in this valley." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uneasily. Then Carver stepped forward, his words smooth as oil poured over stone. He unfolded the papers with a practiced flourish, holding them high for all to see. "The matter is not only of family," he said, his voice urbane, calculated. "This land that Elias claims as his own has never been rightfully his. Here are deeds, records, signed and sealed, proving that it belongs to the railroad company. He is a squatter, a thief of opportunity, and he must be removed for the good of progress, for the prosperity of all who dwell in this valley." His smile was confident, his tone dripping with the certainty of a man who thought himself untouchable. The room bristled with unease, the tide swaying toward the villain's will. But then Miriam rose. Her bonnet cast a shadow over her pale face, but her eyes shone with a quiet fire. Her hands trembled as she held the journal Elias had urged her to keep, its pages worn with ink. She stepped forward, her voice small at first, then steadying as she read aloud the words she had written in nights of candlelight. She spoke of the whip, of the lashes that burned across her skin, of the prayers whispered through tears in a house where love was withheld. She told of the night she fled into the storm, of the fear that she would perish alone, and of the refuge she had found in a cabin where silence had become safety. Her words did not come as accusation but as testimony, and as they fell into the still air of the church hall, faces softened, mothers clutched their children closer, men shifted in shame, and the room began to see not a disobedient daughter, but a girl who had endured more than most could bear. Sister Ruth then rose, her presence commanding in its quiet dignity. She stepped forward, her eyes sweeping across the crowd, and with deliberate care she took the papers from Carver's hand. "You speak of law," she said, her voice firm. "But the law is not upheld by lies." She held the deeds to the lantern light, pointing to signatures clumsy and inconsistent, to seals that bore the mark of forgery. "These are false, forged by a man who seeks not prosperity for the town, but wealth for himself." Gasps filled the hall, and Carver's smile faltered, his polished demeanor cracking as whispers of fraud and deceit rippled through the assembly. Through it all, Elias stood at the back of the hall, silent but unyielding. He spoke no words, made no gestures, yet his presence loomed like the mountains themselves. His scarred hands rested at his sides, his gaze steady and unwavering, and the people felt the weight of his quiet strength. He did not need to defend himself. His life of solitude had already spoken for him. When Miriam closed her journal and Sister Ruth lowered the false deeds, the hall was no longer divided. The villain's venom had curdled, their words exposed as cruelty and fraud. The truth had been spoken, plain and earnest, and it stirred the hearts of those gathered. For the first time, the tide turned not with whispers of fear, but with the rising certainty of justice. The storm that had gathered in the valley had broken, and its first crack of thunder sounded there in the church hall, in the voice of a girl who had once been silent, and the resolve of a community awakened to the truth. The day the traveling judge arrived, the town gathered once more in the church hall, its whitewashed walls heavy with anticipation. Word had spread that Sister Ruth, unwilling to let the matter rest on rumor and forged documents, had sent a rider to summon authority from beyond their valley. And now that authority had come a man, robed in black, his face weathered by years of judgment, his eyes sharp and unflinching, His presence carried a gravity that silenced the murmurs and straightened the spines of those who had wavered between fear and compassion. Jacob Stoltzfus stood stiff near the front, his arms crossed, his mouth set in a grim line. Carver was beside him, his polished boots shining, though his confidence had waned since Ruth had exposed the flaws in his deeds. Still, he carried himself with the air of a man who believed his wealth and smooth words would bend justice to his will. Miriam sat with Sister Ruth at her side, her journal clutched tightly in her lap, and behind her Elias stood, silent as ever, his presence steady as a mountain. The judge began with calm authority, hearing first from Jacob. The father's words were bitter, filled with fire and self-righteousness. He spoke of a daughter gone astray, of obedience owed, of shame brought upon his household. His voice thundered with the conviction of a man certain that Scripture and law alike supported his claim. Yet beneath his words, the crowd sensed something harsher than duty, something twisted into cruelty, and the judge's eyes narrowed as Jacob railed on. Then Carver stepped forward, presenting his papers with a flourish, insisting upon the railroad's rights. He painted pictures of prosperity, of tracks laid across the wilderness, of goods and fortune flowing into the valley. But when pressed to account for the irregularities Ruth had uncovered, his smooth tongue faltered. The judge examined the documents with care, holding them to the light, tracing the lines of the forged signatures, and his face hardened. "These are false," he declared, his voice ringing out with finality. "A fraud upon this community and upon the law." Gasps filled the hall, and Carver paled, his confidence crumbling. He stammered, but the judge's gavel struck the table, silencing him. At last, Miriam was called to speak. With trembling hands, she opened her journal and, for the second time, read of her suffering. Her voice broke at moments, but she did not falter. She told of the whip, of the silence forced upon her, of the storm she had fled, and of the refuge she had found in Elias's cabin. Her testimony was not ornamented, only plain and earnest, and it pierced the hearts of those listening more deeply than any polished argument. The judge sat back, his gaze falling heavy upon Jacob. "No father has the right to raise his hand in cruelty," he said sternly. "What you call discipline was abuse. What you call obedience was tyranny. This child is no longer bound to your house. She is free, under the protection of the law and of those who would show her compassion." Jacob's face darkened, his jaw clenching, but he could not speak against the authority before him. The hall watched as his pride was stripped bare, his claim shattered. Turning then to Elias, the judge spoke with equal clarity. "Your land is yours by right. No forged deed, no greedy scheme will rob you of it. You have stood in silence, but your silence has been strength, and the law stands with you." The crowd erupted in murmurs, some of relief, some of shame for ever doubting. Carver's polished facade was ruined, his fraud laid open for all to see. Jacob stood humiliated, his authority broken, his cruelty unveiled, and in their downfall, the valley saw clearly where justice lay. Miriam clutched her journal to her chest, tears shining in her eyes, and for the first time since she had fled into the storm, she felt the weight of chains lift from her heart. Elias inclined his head slightly, his expression unchanged, yet within him stirred a vindication he had not thought to feel again. The law had spoken, and for once it had chosen mercy over cruelty, truth over lies. The villains left the hall in disgrace, their power broken, while the people rose to their feet, not in gossip this time, but in recognition that goodness had prevailed. The storm that had gathered over the valley had broken at last, and though the rain of judgment fell hard, it washed the air clean. Justice had been declared, and with it, the way forward stood open, clear, and bright. The valley awoke differently after the judgment, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. Where once suspicion had lingered like smoke, now the air carried a freshness born of truth laid bare. Elias's cabin, once spoken of in hushed tones as the dwelling of a cursed hermit, became a place the townsfolk approached openly, though at first with tentative steps. They came not with accusations, but with tools in hand, ready to mend fences, cut timber, and repair the weathered walls that had stood alone for too long. It was Sister Ruth who led them, her voice carrying the simple reminder that community is not only bound by blood, but also by compassion. Miriam stood in the clearing, her skirts brushing against the grass, watching as men raised a new beam for the roof, while women brought baskets of food to share. She felt the weight of astonishment in her chest. Only weeks before she had been a whisper of scandal on their lips, condemned for fleeing her father's hand. Now those same neighbors smiled at her shyly, some with shame in their eyes for having judged too quickly, others with warmth as though she were kin reclaimed. She met each glance with quiet gratitude, her heart swelling with the strange, tender realization that she belonged not in a cage of cruelty, but in a circle of care. Elias moved among them with a stiffness at first, his solitude reluctant to bend beneath their sudden goodwill. Yet, as the hours passed, as hammers rang and saws bit into wood, a change began to etch itself upon his face. A flicker of something long forgotten touched his eyes when he saw Miriam laughing softly with the children who had followed their parents up the ridge. Her hands were in the earth, planting seeds she had saved in a pouch, showing the little ones how to press them gently into the soil. Her voice was light, instructive, and hopeful, and Elias found himself smiling before he realized it. The cabin, once cloaked in shadow, now rang with the sounds of life. The hearth fire burned brighter, not because of the wood alone, but because voices filled the air, voices that did not condemn but encouraged. Neighbors lingered after the day's work, sharing bread at Elias's table, listening as Miriam read short passages from her journal with a trembling but steady voice. The words she had once written in secrecy now became testimony of endurance, and though her cheeks flushed as she read, she saw the nods of understanding in their eyes. Her voice, once silenced by fear, had become a thread, weaving her into the fabric of the community. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky blushed with rose and gold, Miriam knelt by the edge of the clearing where the garden had begun to sprout. A rustle in the grass drew her gaze, and she saw the bird she had nursed weeks ago perched on a stump, its wing once broken, now strong and sure. It hopped once, twice, then lifted into the air, its wings catching the light as it soared across the clearing. Miriam's eyes followed it, her lips parting in a smile that brimmed with tears. Elias, watching from the porch, saw the same bird and knew the symbol without words. Wounds could heal. Flight could be regained. Even hearts, once shattered by fire and cruelty, could find their way back to the sky. In that moment, beneath the settling glow of evening, Miriam and Elias were no longer the runaway and the recluse. They were something new, something stronger. Two souls bound not by blood or law, but by the fierce grace of survival and compassion. And around them, the town that had once feared and scorned now stood beside them, forming a family larger than either had imagined. The bird vanished into the horizon, but its flight lingered in their hearts, a promise of beginnings yet to come. The valley wore a gentler face in the months that followed, the storm of fear and greed now a memory fading like thunder after rain. Where once the ridge was whispered of as the haunt of a cursed recluse, now it rang with voices bright and eager. The old cabin had been repaired, but more than that, a new structure had risen nearby, a modest schoolhouse, its frame built with the hands of townsfolk who had once turned their backs. It was Sister Ruth's idea, spoken in her calm way one evening after supper. "What better sign of healing," she had said, "than a place where children learn, where cruelty has no place, and kindness is sown from the start." So the schoolhouse was built, its walls plain but sturdy, its windows wide enough to let the mountain light spill in. On its first day, children filed inside, their cheeks red from the climb, their laughter ringing through the clearing. At the front of the room stood Elias, his broad frame now less burdened by solitude, his voice steady though still roughened by years of silence. He taught them not only letters and numbers, but also the knowledge of the woods, the way to read the clouds for rain, the sound of an axe when it strikes clean, the care of animals, the honor of labor. He spoke plainly, never with flourish, but the children listened, their eyes wide, for in his presence they felt the weight of a man who had walked through fire and sorrow, yet still stood upright. Miriam moved among the rows, her hands gentle as she guided the younger ones, her smile soft as she praised their work. On a shelf by the window lay her journal, its pages now nearly filled, not with laments alone, but with hope, dreams, and lessons meant to be shared. The girl who had once whispered prayers in fear now read aloud to the children in a voice clear and sure. She told them stories of courage, not only her own, but of others, stories that reminded them that even in hardship, goodness can be found and built upon. Outside, the townsfolk gathered, some leaning on fence rails, others carrying baskets of food for the midday meal. They watched the children through the open doorway, their own laughter joining the chorus. They had once gossiped, condemned, and feared, but now they stood united, their divisions healed by the steady work of compassion. The valley that had nearly lost its soul had found it again in the simple act of neighbors standing with one another. As the day waned and the children spilled out into the clearing to play, Elias stood in the doorway, his scarred hands resting easily against the frame. Miriam joined him, her bonnet tipped back, her eyes shining as she looked over the garden they had planted together, now green with life. For the first time in many years, Elias allowed himself a smile that did not vanish quickly, but lingered, steady and unashamed. And so the story closes, not in shadows but in light, with a community remade, a girl freed from cruelty, and a man redeemed from exile. Cruelty can break, it is true, it can scar hands, silence voices, and drive souls into solitude. But kindness and courage can heal. They can mend what fire has burned, they can turn whispers of shame into songs of hope, and they can bind together what once lay in pieces. Friend, if you have walked with Miriam and Elias through this tale, remember that their story is not only of the frontier but of the heart. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you are part of this story too. Let me know in the comments which state you are watching from, and do not forget to like and subscribe so we may continue to share more stories of redemption, healing, and hope. For every broken past, there is a chance at a brighter future, and together we keep those stories alive.